Hello, Reddit. I don't understand how she could do that. Give birth to an unwanted child, thus ruining our lives. Let's go in order. My girlfriend Mike, my best friend Kyle, and his girlfriend Angela all went down to Miami for a month-long resort trip. It sounded like the perfect break, a time to soak up the sun, hit up the bars and clubs, and just let loose. Being only 20, none of us had gone on a trip like this before, so we wanted to make it memorable. I thought it'd just be about having a good time, but things got strange real quick. From the start, there was a weird vibe between Mike and Angela. Don't get me wrong. It was great that our girlfriends were getting along and had each other to enjoy the clubs while Kyle and I did our thing. But soon, Mike and Angela started spending way too much time together at every bar, every disco, and even by the pool. And by together, I mean they were inseparable. It wasn't that Kyle and I didn't get along with them, but they seemed completely uninterested in hanging with us guys once we all got there. And it wasn't just that. The way they were getting attention from other guys everywhere we went was definitely starting to be something neither Kyle nor I could ignore. One night, for example, we all went out to this popular nightclub near the beach. It was packed, lights flashing, music blaring, drinks everywhere. Kyle and I found a spot at the bar where we could keep an eye on Mike and Angela, who were dancing like they were on stage. Guys were glancing over, some even trying to join in. And although we didn't think much of it at first, it kept happening. They were definitely attracting attention, and it wasn't hard to see why. After a few rounds of drinks, Kyle and I talked about it, agreeing it was a bit strange, but ultimately not wanting to make a big deal of it. After all, we thought, it's a vacation. Maybe they're just blowing off some steam. But this didn't let up. At nearly every club and bar, it was like Mike and Angela were looking to catch every guy's eye in the room. And I'll admit, it started to feel off, like maybe this wasn't just about having fun. I mean, sure, people drink and party a little harder on vacation, but the way they disappear to the dance floor or end up laughing with strangers kept putting me on edge. Kyle noticed it too, and we talked about it every so often, usually with a shrug and a, hopefully, they'll cool down by the end of the trip. Yet each day, the energy between Mike and Angela only seemed to get wilder. Then, halfway through the month, something happened that changed the whole dynamic. It was around midday. I was lying by the pool, catching some sun and just relaxing, and that's when Mike came over, holding something behind her back. She had this huge grin, and before I could ask, she pulled out a pregnancy test, 2 solid lines, right there. She looked me in the eye and said, "We're having a baby." Now, at that moment, I won't lie to you guys, I had no idea how to react. We talked about it before, and I'd been clear about not wanting kids this young. But seeing that test, I nodded, maybe out of reflex or shock. I mean, what else was I supposed to do? Later that night, I met up with Kyle at one of the quieter bars in the resort. When I told him the news, he froze. He choked a little on his drink and looked at me like I dropped a bomb. Now, I'd expected him to be surprised, sure, but this reaction was way more than that. If you'd been there, you'd have seen it too. It was like something genuinely shocked him. I knew it seemed weird since everyone knew I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of kids yet, especially at 20. I figured maybe he thought we'd been more careful or that Mike and I wouldn't take that step anytime soon. But something in his reaction stuck with me. It wasn't just surprise. It felt like there was something else under there, something I couldn't put my finger on. The rest of the trip carried on, but let me tell you, that moment in the bar had me looking at things differently. One afternoon, we decided to go out on a boat, rent it for a few hours, and just explore some nearby islands. This was supposed to be one of those laid-back days where we could all just chill without the club scene. The boat rental place gave us some snorkeling gear, and after a while, Kyle and Angela jumped into the water to explore the reefs. I stayed on the boat with Mike, who was suddenly being quiet. Usually, she was the life of every party on this trip, so seeing her just sitting there staring off into the water was new. I asked her if she was okay, and she shrugged, saying she was just tired. When Kyle and Angela got back on the boat, they were laughing like they'd just had the time of their lives. But as soon as Mike saw them, she suddenly perked up. It was a small detail, but it kept nagging at me. It was like she was only down when they weren't around. And then, almost immediately after, she was back to acting like nothing was bothering her. You guys ever notice something like that? Something small, maybe meaningless, but you can't shake it? So, after we got back home, things between me and Mike went from weird to outright tense. I could feel it in the way she avoided talking about the pregnancy and got defensive whenever I asked anything remotely serious. So finally, I suggested we do a DNA test, trying to keep it casual, but I could tell she picked up on the underlying question. She hesitated. Longer than I expected, honestly, and right then, it was like I already had my answer. There was a long pause, then she asked why I'd even bring it up, which, of course, led to an argument. She denied everything at first, but I pushed, reminding her that after a month-long trip full of her and Angela's extra relaxation sessions with random strangers, it wasn't exactly an unreasonable request. Finally, after way too much back and forth, Mike broke down and admitted it. The child wasn't mine, it was Kyle's. Turns out, while I'd been trying to brush off all those suspicious glances, they'd been hiding something big. So here I was, finding out that my supposed best friend, who'd been supporting me throughout this, was actually the father of Mike's kid. I thought he was just shocked when I first told him in Miami. I didn't realize he was hiding his own part in the story. That news blew everything up. I immediately cut ties with Mike. There was no way around it. It was done. But then I found out that Angela, Kyle's girlfriend, had also found out what happened. She didn't waste any time, either, and left him the minute she found out the baby was his. It was a double breakup, and trust me, it didn't happen quietly. For a few days, it seemed like everyone knew about it. Friends, family, people from work. All of them caught wind of the whole situation somehow. And to add to the mess, Kyle made it very clear he wanted nothing to do with the kid. No support, no involvement, nothing. He washed his hands of the whole thing, leaving Mike on her own, now dealing with the fallout from her own choices and facing a future as a single parent. I thought that would be the end of it, but a couple of weeks later, while I was sitting in this small cafe I go to sometimes, who should walk in but Angela? She saw me, and after a second, came over and asked if she could join me. I was surprised, but I nodded, and she took a seat. It was a quiet place, so we just sat there for a minute without saying much. Then, almost naturally, we started talking about what happened, filling each other in on details neither of us knew about. She told me her side of things, how Kyle had been sneaky about everything, how he told her one story and then acted like everything was fine the whole time we were in Miami. I shared a bit about the DNA test mess and how the whole situation had blindsided me. We ended up sitting there for hours, swapping stories and just talking. At one point, Angela asked if I wanted to get out of there and grab dinner somewhere else. By now, the cafe was closing, so we left and ended up at her place since she'd suggested just making something simple. It felt like we were just two people finding some kind of strange, unexpected connection over this shared situation. We made some pasta, nothing fancy, but we kept talking while we cooked. By the time dinner was done, the whole atmosphere had shifted, like we both realized we didn't want the night to end just yet. She asked if I wanted to stay a little longer, maybe watch a movie or something, and I didn't even hesitate. It was late when we finally moved from the couch to her room, and yeah, that's where the night took its own turn. The next morning, things weren't awkward or anything. We just ended up talking again, like neither of us wanted to leave just yet. It was the kind of night that neither of us saw coming, but somehow, it felt like we'd both found a little bit of closure in all this. All right, so here's the wrap-up to the whole situation that started with the trip to Miami, Mike's pregnancy reveal, and the fallout from discovering that Kyle was actually the father. After everything went down with Mike and Kyle, things between Angela and me just sort of evolved. We kept seeing each other after that night, and things developed naturally between us. You could say we found a kind of balance with each other, having gone through the same mess. So here's what happened from that point on. Angela and I kept things casual for the first year or so. Both of us needed time to adjust after our respective breakups, so we took it slow. No big declarations, no major commitments right away. It was just hanging out, grabbing dinners, watching movies, and finding some comfort in the normal stuff. We didn't label anything, and it was probably the best way we could have handled things. I think we both knew jumping into something serious immediately would have been a recipe for disaster. We both kept our distance from Mike and Kyle after that. Kyle actually tried reaching out a few times, I guess to apologize or explain, but I wasn't interested in hearing him out. What was there to say, really? We were done as friends. and there was no point trying to salvage anything from that. Mike, on the other hand, left things alone and didn't contact me, which was probably for the best. Last I heard, she moved out of town to live with her parents. From what I know, she's raising the kid on her own. No involvement from Kyle or anyone else, but that's really her story to deal with. As for Angela and me, things just kept progressing naturally. After about 2 years of dating, I brought up the idea of us moving in together. She was on board, and we ended up renting a small place downtown. Nothing fancy, but it felt like ours. We had our routines. Angela would make breakfast on weekends, and I'd handle most of the cleaning. It wasn't anything grand, but it was solid. That's when I realized things were finally settling into something real, something we both felt comfortable with. A few months after moving in, I proposed. It was nothing elaborate. We'd spent the day out, going to some of our usual spots around town, and when we got back to our place, I just asked. She said yes without any hesitation, and that was that. We didn't make a big deal of it. No big parties, no extended family gathering. Just a quick courthouse ceremony with a couple of close friends who knew our whole story. Angela's parents came too, but mine, well, they weren't exactly supportive, considering everything that went down with Mike. They were still skeptical of Angela, seeing as she was Kyle's ex and all. But at that point, it didn't really matter. Angela and I were moving forward on our own terms. A year after we got married, Angela told me she was pregnant. This time, I felt more ready for it. We'd had enough time to get to know each other well, had a stable routine, and our finances were in decent shape. Angela and I didn't make a big fuss about it. We just quietly prepared for the arrival of our daughter. I helped set up the nursery in our apartment, assembling the crib and all the baby furniture. We picked out a few basic things and spent some weekends hitting up stores, choosing outfits and other essentials. When our daughter was born, we kept it low-key. Angela's parents visited to help out in the first couple of weeks, but we mainly did things ourselves. Adjusting to parenthood came with its usual stuff: late nights, early mornings, and constant trips to the store for diapers. I was handling a lot of the late-night bottle runs, and Angela took over during the day. We had our share of chaotic moments, but nothing out of the ordinary for new parents. As life settled, I found myself reflecting on how everything had started. I won't lie, there were times I'd look back at the whole Miami fiasco and wonder how things would have turned out if Mike and Kyle hadn't crossed those lines. It's strange, but despite everything, I can't bring myself to regret where I ended up. Angela and I went through a lot to get here, and somehow, it's like all the pieces fell into place on their own. But here's the thing, Reddit. I'd love to get your thoughts on all this. What would you guys have done in my place? Would you have tried to fix things with Mike? Would you have confronted Kyle differently? Or maybe I was too quick to trust Angela in the first place, considering her own history with Kyle. There's a lot to unpack here, and after 3 years, I feel like I've found a path that works for me. But part of me wonders if there's something I missed along the way. So, Reddit, if you've got any advice or perspective, I'm all ears.